John 6:64. Sed sunt quidam ex vobis, qui non credunt. Sciebat enim ab initio Iesus, qui essent credentes et quis traditurus esset eum. But there are certain ones among you all who do not believe. For Jesus, from the beginning, knew who was believing and who would betray him. There's really one big thing I want to focus on in this verse to try and help you make sense of it, and that is this pair of indirect questions introduced by qui and quis here, following a verb of reporting. Again, included in this class are verbs of saying, thinking, knowing, feeling, perceiving, those sorts of words. And we're going to depend here on your knowledge of the sequence of tenses. This is a concept probably at some point you learned in your textbook or in your grammar of choice. If it's a bit fuzzy, you'll need to refer back to it as you watch this video, because I'm just going to touch on that aspect of things lightly. According to the sequence of tenses, a historical tense, here the imperfect, of course the indicative imperfect, a historical tense in the main clause needs to be followed by a historical tense in the subordinate clause. And in fact, that's what we get here. Essent is imperfect subjunctive. Now, traditurus esset is not, but we're going to talk about why that's the case in a moment, because that's going to require some extra explanation here. So I want you to notice, first of all, that we have two choices in a subordinate clause like this when we want to indicate the relative time of the action in the subordinate clause relative to the action of the main clause. We know it has to be historical. It's got to be one of the historical tenses because of sciebat, because of that imperfect. But we've got two choices. We could use the imperfect subjunctive or the pluperfect subjunctive. But since the sense here that the action of essent credentes is at the same time as sciebat, that's why we use the imperfect subjunctive. The imperfect subjunctive is the historical tense we use in a subordinate subjunctive clause to indicate, hey, this action here is happening at the same time as or subsequent to sciebat. So Jesus knew from the beginning who was believing at that same time that he was knowing these things, contemporaneously with him knowing these things. But there's an ambiguity here, right? Because if instead of traditurus esset, we had traderet, which would be the imperfect subjunctive matching essent, the sense would be Jesus knew from the beginning who was believing at the same time as his knowing, and who, now we run into a problem. Does traderet mean who was betraying him contemporaneously with sciebat, or would traderet refer to the future? Well, theoretically, it could be either. It could be either because, again, we use the imperfect subjunctive in subordinate clauses to indicate action that is either contemporaneous with or subsequent to the action of this main verb, sciebat. So there's an ambiguity there. But the narrator is making a distinction between Jesus' knowledge of who was then at that time believing and his knowledge of who would in the future, not now, not at that same time, but later on, betray him. Now, traderet, technically, according to the rules or the typical patterns of Latin, could do that job. The imperfect subjunctive could indicate potentially future, but it would be really ambiguous. How would you know that it was the future rather than the contemporaneous notion there? So our translator uses a different construction, and this is called the future periphrastic. Periphrastic is from a Greek word that just means a circumlocution, something, a really roundabout way of saying something. Our translator uses the future periphrastic to remove that ambiguity and make it totally obvious and definitive that the betraying in contrast to the believing is going to happen in the future. The believing is going to happen at the same time as relative to skiebat, but the betraying is still to come in the future. Again, he could have used traderet, but it would have made things confusing for readers, so he goes out of his way to make it super clear. Now, we've got to notice, qui essent and credentes are all plural. Jesus knew from the beginning who was believing, but when it says he knew from the beginning who would betray him, look at this. This is a singular form. This is a singular form. This is a singular form. That's because it's not a group who's going to betray him. It's one person, Judas. So Jesus knows who is going to betray him, but our translator, again, has to use, or chooses, helpfully, to use the future periphrastic to make it absolutely clear in a subordinate clause, in the subjunctive mood, what the relationship in time is between all these different actions. If this seems complex to you, you could be forgiven for feeling that complexity. It's even a little bit hard to articulate how all of this works together, but it does make good logical sense, and our translator has done us a favor here in making these things extra clear.